Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much. It's actually amazing and an honour to stand in front of more than 1,000 people in this room to probably talk about one of the biggest projects that I've definitely worked on, and something that I think has probably been talked about and worked on for the 16 months that I've actually been in this company as well. But a key thing, I guess, what I want to sort of focus on today, and obviously the two previous keynote speakers really sort of touched on some key things. We've got some challenges, not from an existential threat that's out there or some sophisticated threats or anything. It's more around changing that dialogue, changing the narrative inside each one of our businesses, around having a true business risk conversation, because truly that's what cybersecurity actually is. It's not all about the bits and bytes. And I'm a techie at heart, but I also believe that we also need to think about the challenges a little bit differently. So going back probably about 2 years ago, we started to embark on a project where we worked closely with the New York Stock Exchange, sat down and started to work on what is it's really needed in the boardrooms to have conversations with senior business leaders around the challenges they're seeing out there impacting their own industries and their own businesses. What we actually found from the number of different data breaches that were constantly taking place was accountability was shared, but knowledge was not. And one of the key things that we really wanted to focus on was not simply create some, I guess, a piece of education or awareness around the world according to Palo Alto Networks, but more a case of creating something for the industry, by the industry. And back then, we worked closely with the New York Stock Exchange, found around 40 contributing thought leaders that all came together and started to write a key piece around what they feel is important, what they could educate other business leaders, board of directors around the key things they need to think about in their respective organisations. As Mark alluded, we're currently now in the 5th print run, and I can honestly say it's amazing to hear the fact that we've actually distributed more than 300,000 copies of Navigating the Digital Age. But fast forward to today, one of the key things that we really wanted to focus on was how do we start to create a guide that is local? Starting to focus more on sort of that local context on what's really happening in Australia. And I think the big thing really that sort of resonates quite well, and obviously having worked in Australia for a number of years, is the fact that there's this, I guess, this notion that she'll be right, mate. And we can always sit there and say that, I'm okay, security's been handled, but this is the way that we've always dealt with security. But the way the threat has actually changed, the way that our businesses have evolved, the way that there's been a number of digital disruptions out there, we need to think about it differently. And this is why we came together, and I was fortunate enough to work with 10 contributing thought leaders that all came together to really share what they believe are key things to change that narrative inside every single one of our organisations. Because a key part about this one is the guide is actually intended to be that how-to guide or that anthology on sharing best practices around what really needs to happen inside those boardroom conversations. And I don't simply believe that it's just a boardroom conversation. I think any business leader needs to think about security differently. They need to think about it as a business risk. For businesses, they understand financial risk. They understand the complications and the implications that could be impacting their own respective businesses. Cybersecurity should be no different. And I think this is why we really need to focus on creating that local context. So it's not just simply the world according to what North America sees. Because there is a bit of a notion sometimes when I've spoken to many organisations over the years that only happens in the US or that only impacts Europe. I believe that this is a challenge that every single organisation has got globally. So with that, I went out and basically started to recruit what I believe are some 10 of the key thought leaders in this space. Mike Burgess, Rachel Falk, getting them together to really sort of start to share what Mike talked about earlier around the 5 no's of cybersecurity. What are the key things that people need to be thinking about in their respective space? Major General Stephen Day saw it at the coalface, heading up the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and his part at running the Australian Signals Directorate for many, many years as well. Cheng Lim, one of the key partners at Kingwood and Mallesons, focused on cybersecurity, sharing his wisdom and knowledge around what do businesses need to think about from a cybersecurity and a law standpoint. Ben Hayes from Commonwealth Bank of Australia, what he's doing around changing and innovating around creating a cybersecurity aware culture inside the enterprise. Jennifer Westacott from the Business Council of Australia, helping organisations understand what are the real cyber risks they need to be thinking about, how it's a true business conversation. David Irvine, who has an extensive experience and history running many different aspects of the Australian intelligence side, sharing his wisdom around what he feels are key things that businesses need to understand around cyber resilience and what he feels are his 10 key elements around each one of those key parts that everyone needs to think about. Adrian Turner from Data 61, leading the effort around the Cyber Innovation Growth Centre that Malcolm Turnbull announced in April this year with the cybersecurity strategy. Arno Brock, many years working in some of the top 4 consulting firms, and now currently the CEO of the Australian Information Security Association. These are all industry leaders. And finally, Toby Feakin, running the founding director and member of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a think tank here in Australia, really advising people on what they need to think about. What's the opportunity that they can grab hold of, and how do they start to leverage that and start to work inside navigating, I guess, the digital age out there. So if I start to dig deep and start to think about what can we actually do, and Toby really focused in his chapter on what are some of the key things that we need to think about as business leaders, and everyone has a part to play here on what is it that we can actually do? What's the role, what role does cybersecurity play in growth when trying to have a business across Asia Pacific? What are some of those key aspects that we all need to think about and leverage? Those unique cybersecurity challenges that impact Australia and potentially impact the prosperous growth of our nation as well. What should we do differently? What are the questions that we should be asking? And also thinking about how do we start to navigate through that and also grow? Not simply grow your own business, but grow as a nation as well. What are some of the key strategies that we should be thinking about and leveraging from what Malcolm Turnbull released and his government released as part of that cybersecurity strategy? Jennifer focuses on what is it that companies need to start focusing on from a business risk. In her piece around the connectivity conundrum, she talks about the fact that we have got this endless supply of compute power, access to data. Consumers have the ability that they can do anything, anywhere, anytime. But with that also becomes a potential challenge around our data is now everywhere, and it starts to become a business risk. And what do we as business leaders need to start thinking about to become more agile in responding to what the consumers actually want, but at the same time making sure that we can provide the levels of protection and integrity to the data that resides in our own respective businesses. Today's the day where consumers are the new regulator. They will demand a lot more, they expect a lot more from us, and as businesses, we need to be able to provide that and provide that in a secure manner. The other key part is why should cybersecurity discussions really focus from just being a technology discussion to something a lot broader? And I think now is the time that we have to do that. Being a techie for many, many years, we can't simply sit there and look at how technology is going to solve all of our cybersecurity challenges. There is a key part around the people, the process, but having a broader context and understanding at that business layer. Cheng Lim focuses on what are some of the key things that we need to be thinking about as business leaders. What are some of the key things that ASIC is actually sort of expecting from every single business out there around their level of compliance, their level of expectations that every single person is legally obliged to by the Corporations Act. This is an interesting chapter for me because it was one of those telling points that I've spent many years talking to a number of Australian organisations where some people probably didn't actually know what their level of expectation actually was. So when I was going through and reading and understanding the chapter, the key thing around here is there's a number of different risk management activities that are generally applied across the entire business. And we need to think about, well, if we do something wrong, what is that level of expectation? What's the expectation that I've got to my shareholders, to the business, to my consumers? When I look at, I guess the previous session when Mike started to go through thinking about how do we actually change this dynamic? And Mike touched on a lot of key points that obviously resonate quite well in the actual piece that both himself and Rachel went through. There is a lot of, I guess, mystique out there that some people believe that cybersecurity is this mysterious risk, that it's hard to understand, hard to really grapple and understand what's really sort of happening out there. Mike touched on in his keynote around that whole threat distraction, threat attribution. It's not all weird and wonderful, sophisticated threats that are out there. Because to think about it from a different aspect, we sometimes leave the keys in the front door to allow people to come in. And if we don't think about those 5 no's, what is the true value of the data to me? What's the value to my competitors? What would be the value if I actually lost that access to that information or was denied access to that information? These are questions that every single business should be asking in themselves. Because ultimately the key part that we could walk away is how do we then start to work out what is key, what's valuable, and where do I actually start to focus my efforts on resourcing and protecting as well? Because I don't need to put protection in place across the entire part of my organization. I can focus my efforts and resources accordingly. The other key part, obviously some of those key questions are around, how do we start to identify what some of those risks and challenges are inside the business, to our customers? How do we start to extend it out to each one of our respective customers as well? If I think about Major General Stephen Day, and he's got a fascinating story when he goes through talking about some of the 4 key questions that he's always asked by every single business. He actually sat down and started to work out, as he started to build out his piece, these are conversations and the same questions that he kept on getting every single time. What do I need to do? Where should I spend my next dollar? What are those key questions around, well, what happens if I don't do anything? And he really starts to break it down in very, very plain English as to what you can start to do inside your own respective organizations to deal with some of those challenges. Where do I spend my next dollar? How should my next dollar be spent? And what should I actually do with it? The panacea is not simply buying that silver bullet of that piece of technology that's going to solve it. It's around changing that dynamic and conversation inside your own respective businesses. From a cyber resilience piece, David Irvine really starts to break down his 10 core elements of understanding what the risk really means inside your business. How do you plan? How do you prepare? How do you start to make your business more resilient as the threats change, but as the risk actually starts to potentially change inside your own respective organization? As that risk posture moves around, how do I then start to balance that out? How do I start to compensate and work out what is really important from a holistic cyber resilience standpoint inside my own respective business or businesses? What are those key elements that are needed around cyber resilience? And this is where Dave really digs deep to understand the risk, understand the consequences, understand the systems and the data inside your own respective businesses, and work out how do you start to get access to some of those professional expertise. And if you start to focus on those 10 key elements and walk away, you think, you know what? This is a very good starting point to think of how do I have those conversations with everyone across the business. Rachel wrote, and I'd probably say it was a record history in terms of one of her pieces that she turned around. I think as many of you would remember, back in August 9th, there was obviously a bit of a request that it was made upon everyone. And a key challenge around that one was, how do you start to manage the core narrative? And media is always going to potentially interpret and also write about your potential issue a lot of different ways. Sometimes you can't control that. But what you can control is your own core narrative. Let the truth set you free. Let that basically be the shining point to say sometimes it's okay that you don't know the answer. And the reality in times of an actual crisis, you may not actually know the answer at all for the first 24 hours. Rachel breaks it down in very, very clear language as to how you can start to deal with a crisis in the event that a crisis does actually pop up. How do you start to manage and remediate from an incident? But if you start to take some of those learnings, you can start to think about how do I plan and prepare in the event that this doesn't actually happen, plan to ensure that it doesn't happen, but at the same time, if it does, I know what I can actually do. And you'll be surprised at how many organizations I constantly speak to that they've never gone back to any type of incident response plan. They don't really know who to talk to, and there's a lot of finger pointing. So controlling the core narrative is absolutely key. Ben Hayes has done an amazing job, I think, when I look at a number of different industries and organizations across Australia. He's really trying to set the benchmark in terms of how do we raise that level of awareness of creating a cybersecurity culture across the enterprise? How do we start to make everyone accountable and also play their part to drive and pull the levers in their own respective organizations that security is everyone's issue? It's not an issue just for the senior management. We all have a role to play. And if I think about some of Mark's key points in his keynote this morning, he really touched on a couple of those key things. Users will always be users. They will always have challenges out there. So it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we play a part in educating, raising the level of awareness that's actually needed out there. But the key thing is ensuring that we all holistically play a part. The CISO's role is not to simply just say, this is my visionary statement of what I would like from a security standpoint. We need to be able to activate every single one of you inside your own organizations to play that part, because we all have a role to play here. Arno tackles, I think, one of the most talked about things around the cybersecurity skill shortage. What are the key things that we should be thinking about? And this is probably one of those interesting ones where I think about everyone is probably going out there right now and saying, well, let's invest, whether it be through government, whether it be through the universities, let's try and upskill that. And I think, great, we all need to do that. But the key part is, how do we start to work out inside our own organisations, what do we need to do differently? How do we start to focus on some of that top talent? And that top talent may not actually come from computer science graduates, engineering students or science students. They could be something that's outside of those particular realms. And I think if we start to work out what are the key things that we need as an industry, it's not simply going to be people that are just focusing on the screens and looking at the ones and zeros. We need people to understand the business risk, to be the translators, to look at risk as a business issue across the board and manage it accordingly. And finally, we've got Adrian that really focuses on how do we start to adopt and move into that next generation of the fourth industrial revolution? How do we start to look at the Internet of Things? How do we start to leverage using technology a lot more, but breaking it down to a point where it's a business conversation? What's your strategy? And if I think over the past year or two that I've actually sort of been going to a number of different conferences and a number of different roundtables, IoT is one of those things that constantly pops up. And you ask senior business leaders, what's your strategy around that? And a lot of them are focused on the shiny bells and whistles around what the opportunity is. But we need to start to make sure that they start to think about what are the business risks when actually adopting a lot of these different types of capabilities that are out there. Depending on who you read, whether it's the Gartners, the IDCs, there's a number of different devices that are going to be popping up over the coming years. We're going to see this explosive growth of devices that are out there, but we need to make sure that cybersecurity actually underpins every single one of those key pieces. More devices out there, we also start to have these other challenges that could impact our own respective businesses. How are those security considerations different to the IoT systems or the OT systems, the operational technology systems that are inside some of our businesses today? But a key thing of what we actually saw over the past 2 years when we started to embark on this project was we didn't really want to come out with that sugar rush of, here is a guide, this is going to solve all of your challenges. It's an ongoing journey. So with the launch of the guide, it does mark the beginning of a dialogue, a conversation that needs to happen across every single part of the business. But the conversation shouldn't end there. So for that reason, we needed to ensure that we could have this continuous and interactive ability to maintain that dialogue. So we launched securityroundtable.org, where we've got contributing authors from the original book, and obviously now with the guide launched locally, to start to continue that dialogue, to start to share their information, their wisdom on how you can start to effectively navigate the cyber risk in our digital world. And a key thing around this one is we didn't want to make it just simply focused on US-centric. So we've opened it up. We've opened it up to our local contributing authors, and also I'm actively going out there and trying to find other people that would like to contribute to this, to continue this dialogue and keep on thinking about how do we start to change that conversation. Because cybersecurity should not stop with one simple guide. As far as I'm concerned, this is the beginning of a journey. It's only just started. So a key part, and I encourage every single one of you to look at the guide, which is going to be available in the break. Probably one of the best reads that you could probably go through. And probably the most passionate part about this one is it's a key part of not just simply raising the education level or the awareness, but it's about how do we start to go out, change that conversation, have a different narrative. Be part of that revolution that we can start to make change happen inside our own respective businesses, to be empowered. For our business leaders to be empowered and to share their knowledge, their wisdom, not only inside their own businesses, but with their peers, whether it's locally in Australia or across the globe. And I encourage every single one of you to read through this and start to dissect and work out how can you change that narrative inside your own businesses to start to navigate that digital age. And finally, key part, if I think back to the strategy that was announced by the Prime Minister, I think it's incumbent on all of us. We all have a part to play. And I guess the best part about it is, considering probably in about 12 hours' time, our government's actually going to be sitting at the seat with the Obama administration to work out how does Australia play an active part? Because I think every country has a part to play. And Alistair McGibbon, who was going to be one of our keynote speakers, is actually sitting there with Malcolm Turnbull to go through and work out how does Australia actually start to have that part to play. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you do read the guide, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.